The rocking horse was still warm from his hands when Louisa Leland found it. She stood in the gray pre-dawn light of her front porch, her lantern swinging low, her breath caught somewhere between her lungs and her throat like a bird that had forgotten how to fly. The carved oak horse sat beside the door, its mane etched in fine, deliberate strokes, its painted eyes dark and knowing, its small saddle shaped from a scrap of real leather that had been oiled until it shone. Around its neck hung a thin strip of rawhide with a single dried wildflower tucked beneath the knot, a blazing star, the kind that grew along the creek bed east of town, where the cottonwoods dipped their roots into the water. She had not heard a sound, not a boot step, not a single creak of the porch boards, nothing. Whoever had left it was already gone. Louisa set the lantern down and pressed her palm to the horse's flank, and the wood was warm, genuinely warm, the way wood stays when human hands have worked it for hours through the night. Her eyes swept the yard, the rutted road, the dark stretch of mesquite that lined the property's edge. Nothing moved. The silence of the Texas panhandle pressed in around her like a fist, and she felt the familiar, terrible ache of being the only person in the world who was awake and completely alone. Behind her, through the thin plank door, she heard Cora stir. Her daughter, 4 years old and already the most perceptive creature Louisa had ever encountered, was waking with that uncanny instinct children have for sensing when their mother's heart is in distress. Louisa swept the rocking horse up into her arms and carried it inside before Cora could come to the door and see it sitting there like a secret that had not yet decided what it wanted to be. And it was a secret. That much was certain. Because the man who had made it, and she knew, with the bone-deep certainty of a woman who has been watching someone too carefully for too long, the man who had made it was Vernon Morgan, the drifter. The quiet one with the scarred left hand and the eyes the color of winter sage, who had been in Mallory Creek for exactly 11 days and had not once spoken more than 6 words to her in a row, and who was, if the rumors circulating through the dry goods store and the feed mill were to be believed, already gone, already saddled up and ridden out before the sun broke the horizon. And that was the betrayal of it, she thought, holding the horse against her chest while Cora padded out in her nightgown and bare feet and stopped short at the sight of the carved animal. That was the hidden wound of it. That he had made something so tender, so precise, so unmistakably full of care and intention, and then he had fled rather than stay to see her face when she found it. "Mama," Cora said, her voice still thick with sleep. "What is that?" Louisa knelt and held the rocking horse out to her daughter, and she watched Cora's eyes go wide and luminous in the lamplight, and she made herself smile even though something inside her chest was pulling apart like old cloth. "It is a gift," Louisa said. "Someone made it for you." "Who?" Cora asked, already reaching. Louisa looked at the door, looked at the darkness beyond it. Thought of Vernon Morgan's hands, the scarred one and the good one, and the way they had moved when he worked, steady and deliberate, like a man who had long ago learned that the only things he trusted were the ones he built himself. "I do not know," she said, and that was a lie. She knew exactly who had done it. The question that would consume her for the next 3 months, the question that would drive her out of her own good sense and into a recklessness she had never thought herself capable of, was not who had left the horse. The question was why he had run, and whether he would come back. And whether, if he did not come back, she would be brave enough or desperate enough to go after him. But to understand all of that, you had to go back to the beginning. To the day Vernon Morgan rode into Mallory Creek on a gray horse with a limp and a bedroll held together with 3 different knots, and looked at Louisa Leland across the width of the main street as though he had been searching for her for a very long time and was not at all sure he was glad to have found her. It was late March of 1879, and the Texas Panhandle was still recovering from a winter that had been vicious and unrelenting. The cattle trails were thick with mud where the ice had finally broken, and every town between Amarillo and the New Mexico territory was full of men passing through, some looking for work, some looking for trouble, some looking for a way to disappear. Mallory Creek sat at the intersection of two wagon roads and had grown up around a single spring-fed well, and it was just large enough to have a general store, a livery, a doctor's office that doubled as a dentist's, a saloon that doubled as everything else, and a small timber church that the Reverend Aldous Pike kept warm and morally demanding. Louisa Leland had come to Mallory Creek 4 years earlier, in 1875, as the wife of a cattle broker named Fletcher Leland. Fletcher had been charming and ambitious, and had a weakness for cards that Louisa had not fully understood until after the wedding, when it became clear that the weakness was not an occasional indulgence but the central organizing principle of his life. He had lost 2 properties, 1 herd, and most of their savings before a fever took him in the winter of 1877, leaving Louisa with a 9-month-old daughter, a house that was technically still hers because Fletcher had owned it outright before they married, and approximately $47 in a tin beneath the floorboard of the kitchen. She had not gone home to her family in Missouri. She had stayed. She had found work taking in mending and alterations, and when the schoolteacher left in 1878, the town had offered her the position despite her being a widow and despite Reverend Pike's reservations, because she was the only person in Mallory Creek who owned more than 3 books and could recite the Declaration of Independence from memory. She taught 8 students in a room behind the church, 5 days a week, and she was regarded by the town with that particular combination of respect and wariness that communities reserve for women who manage to survive without the help of a man. She was 26 years old in the spring of 1879. She was capable and composed, and she had not cried in front of another person since the week Fletcher died. She had, in the 2 years since his death, received exactly 1 offer of courtship, from the widower Harlan Duff, who was 53 and smelled of tobacco and rendered fat, and she had declined it with such precise and courteous language that Harlan had gone away feeling almost complimented. She was not waiting for anyone. She had decided, with the pragmatic resignation of a woman who has learned to trust her own judgment and no one else's, that she was probably done with love. That love was a word that described a feeling she had perhaps never actually experienced, since what she had felt for Fletcher in the beginning had turned out to be a combination of loneliness and inexperience rather than anything true. She was content, or close enough to content that she had stopped examining the difference. And then Vernon Morgan rode into Mallory Creek on his gray horse with the limp, and looked at her, and she had felt something shift in her chest like a compass needle swinging north. She had been standing in front of the general store with a bundle of fabric she had just purchased for a dress she was altering for Nora Aldercott, and he had ridden past slowly, the way men rode when they were looking for a place to stop, and his eyes had found her in that crowd of nobody in particular, and stayed there for 3 full seconds before he looked away and continued on to the livery. 3 seconds. She had counted them. She had replayed them that evening while Cora slept, which was the first indication that she was in trouble. Vernon Morgan was 31 years old, though Louisa did not know that for some time. He was not a large man, not the kind of physically imposing figure that commanded a room simply by being in it, but there was something about the way he carried himself that made him impossible to overlook. He was lean and weathered, with the kind of face that had been handsome once and had since become something more interesting, all angles and shadows, and a jaw that looked like it had learned to absorb punishment. His hair was dark and he wore it a little too long, and he had a habit of running his good right hand through it when he was thinking, which he seemed to be doing almost constantly. The scar on his left hand ran from the base of his thumb across the back of his palm and disappeared under his wrist. It was old and well-healed, but it had left the skin there tight and ridged, and he seemed to favor that hand sometimes without thinking about it, the way people do with old injuries they have learned to work around. He put his horse up at the livery and paid for 3 nights in advance. He did not go to the saloon. He bought a meal at the boarding house that Mrs. Pearl Ackaffer ran from her kitchen window, and he ate it sitting on the front steps of the boarding house, looking at the street with an expression that was not unfriendly but was very clearly private. He said good evening to the people who walked past. He did not invite conversation. He was, in the language of the frontier, a drifter, a man between places and purposes. The West was full of them in 1879, men who had been displaced by the war or by poverty or by some personal catastrophe they did not discuss, and who moved from town to town doing what work was available, and then moving on before anything could attach itself to them. Most of them were harmless. Some were not. All of them carried something they were not talking about. Vernon Morgan paid for 3 nights and stayed for 11 days, which was the first sign that Mallory Creek had gotten under his skin, or something in it had. The second sign was that on the 3rd day, he offered to help fix the roof of the schoolroom, which had developed a leak over the winter that dripped steadily onto the reading corner when it rained. He made the offer to the Reverend Pike, not to Louisa, and she was told about it second-hand and found herself unreasonably irritated by this, though she could not explain why. He spent a full day up on that roof with a hammer and a bag of cedar shingles he had purchased himself, and when Louisa arrived to open the school that morning and found him there, they had their first real conversation. It lasted approximately 4 minutes because he was 12 feet up and she was standing in the yard below, and they were both making a performance of the conversation being practical and nothing else. She told him she had intended to hire someone to fix the roof when she could afford it. He said he did not mind helping. She said she would pay him. He said it was not necessary. She said she insisted. He was quiet for a moment and then said all right, if she insisted. She could leave a plate of food on the school steps at noon, and they would call it even. She said that seemed like poor compensation for a day's labor. He said it was better than most jobs he had taken. She did not know what to do with that answer, so she went inside and taught her students and tried not to think about the sound of his hammer directly above her head, steady and patient and rhythmic, working until the job was done. She left a plate at noon. He ate it on the steps. She watched from the window at an angle she told herself was entirely coincidental, and when Cora ran past the school on her way home from Mrs. Ackaffer's where she spent her days, Vernon Morgan looked at the little girl with an expression Louisa caught only for a moment through the glass, something unguarded and complicated and quietly sorrowful, like a man looking at something he cannot keep. That expression haunted her. Cora, for her part, was the kind of child who had no instinct for shyness and an absolute belief that all adults were basically friendly until demonstrated otherwise. She stopped when she noticed the man sitting on the steps, looked him over with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old and said, "You have a scar on your hand." Vernon looked at her, then at his hand, then back at her. "I do," he said. "How did you get it?" Cora asked. "Working," he said. It was not the whole truth, but it was not a lie either. "Does it hurt?" Cora asked. "Not anymore," he said. Cora nodded, satisfied, and ran on. Vernon watched her go. Louisa stepped back from the window. The next 8 days were a particular kind of quiet torment that Louisa recognized in herself with exhausted clarity. It was the torment of a woman who is acutely aware of another person's presence, and equally aware that she has no business being aware of it. She saw him in town every day. He had found work at the livery while his horse's leg healed. The animal had a mild tendon strain from hard travel, and he spent his days there and his evenings working on something at the workbench old Hector Slade kept at the back of the livery building, a long table lit by 2 hanging lanterns where Hector did his harness repairs. She did not know what Vernon was making. She did not ask. She had too much pride and too much sense. What she knew was this. He always said good morning when he saw her. He tipped his hat. He stepped aside on the narrow boardwalk to let her pass. He had the manners of a man who had been raised carefully and had not entirely shed them despite whatever the intervening years had done to him. When she dropped her basket of mending on the main street one windy afternoon and half the pieces scattered across the mud, he was there in 4 long strides and helped her collect them, and their hands touched over a half-finished boy's shirt, and neither of them said anything for a moment, and the moment lasted just long enough to become significant. "Thank you," she said. "Of course," he said. She looked at him directly because she was not the kind of woman who avoided looking at things she was afraid of. His eyes were the color she had thought, that pale, serious gray-green, like sage after rain, and they were looking back at her with the same quality she had noticed on the first day, that sense of recognition and resistance coexisting in the same glance. Like a man who sees exactly what is happening and has already decided he cannot afford to let it. She understood that look. She had worn it herself. "You are good with your hands," she said, because she had noticed the precision of his work on the school roof, the clean, tight lines of the new shingles that sat flush and even where the old ones had been cracked and skewed. Something moved behind his eyes. "I have had a lot of practice," he said. "What do you do," she asked, "when you are not passing through?" He was quiet for exactly long enough to make her wonder if she had been too direct, and then he said, "Whatever needs doing." It was not an answer. It was also not a refusal. It was the kind of careful non-answer that a person gives when they want to stay in the conversation but not let you too close, and Louisa filed it away the way she filed everything, precisely, and for later retrieval. She had nodded and thanked him again and walked on. That night she sat on her porch after Cora was in bed and looked at the stars, which were enormous and violent and impossibly numerous over the flat dark of the Texas plain, and she had a conversation with herself that was honest and uncomfortable and ultimately inconclusive. She was aware of Vernon Morgan in the specific way that meant her body had already made a decision her mind was still pretending to debate. She was aware that he was leaving. Men like him always left. She had seen enough of them to know that the drifting was not a circumstance but a personality, a deliberate, protective distance from everything that might require them to stay. She had a daughter. She had a life she had built with her own hands on the rubble of one that hadn't worked. She could not afford to want things that were already halfway out the door. She went to bed and she slept badly and she woke before dawn. And the first thing she thought of was Vernon Morgan's hands collecting her scattered mending from the mud. And she pressed her face into her pillow and made a sound that was not quite a word. That was the night of day 9. On day 10, something happened that changed the temperature of everything. It was a Saturday, which meant no school, and Louisa was at the dry goods store when she overheard 2 men she did not know well, cattlemen, passing through, rough-looking and loose-tongued, talking about a woman traveling alone on the Caprock Road who had apparently run into trouble with a 3rd man, also from their outfit, a man named Doyle who had a reputation for not keeping his hands to himself. The way they were talking about it was wrong. It was all wrong, amused, casual, the way men sometimes talk about a bad thing as though the woman's distress was a detail of the landscape rather than the point of the story. Louisa felt the familiar cold rage of a woman who has listened to too many conversations like this one, and does not have the social power to do what she actually wants to do, which is to pick up something heavy and bring it down decisively. She was still deciding what to do with the information when she walked out of the store and nearly ran directly into Vernon Morgan, who was coming from the opposite direction, and whose face told her immediately that he had already heard something, or sensed something, because he was moving with a different quality of purpose than she had seen in him before, focused, directed, stripped of the usual careful quietness. "The woman on the Caprock Road," Louisa said, before she could stop herself. "Do you know?" He stopped, looked at her. "Someone told me," he said, "just now. Are you going?" Something crossed his face, and she could not read all of it, but part of it was surprise that she had asked, that she had already known, that they were standing here having this conversation as though they had an established shorthand. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said, and then, because she could not help it, "Be careful." He looked at her for a long second. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing that thing they did, that complicated balancing act of wanting and not allowing. "I will," he said. He went. She went home and sat at the kitchen table and sewed with hands that were not entirely steady, and Cora played on the floor with a collection of smooth stones she had sorted by color, and the afternoon stretched out long and uncountable. He came back at dusk. She saw him ride past from the kitchen window, the same steady pace as always, but there was a line of tension through his shoulders that had not been there in the morning. The woman from the Caprock Road was with him. It turned out a Mrs. Ethel Crane from New Mexico, who had been heading back to her brother's ranch after a visit east, and who Vernon had found shaken and frightened but physically unharmed, and escorted the last 12 miles into Mallory Creek and settled at Mrs. Ockhaffer's boarding house before going back to the livery to see to his horse. The man named Doyle, by accounts that filtered through town over the next few hours in that way information travels in small places, had declined to pursue the matter further after a brief and apparently conclusive conversation with Vernon, in which no shots were fired, but in which Vernon's manner had communicated certain possibilities with sufficient clarity. Doyle's companions had helped him find his horse, and they had ridden west and not come back. Louisa heard all of this second-hand. She went to bed that night thinking about a man who helped strangers on the road and asked for nothing and told nobody, and went back to the livery afterward to make sure his horse was all right. And she accepted that the argument she had been making to herself, that she was not interested, that she was too sensible for this, that she had Cora to think about and a life to protect, was an argument she was losing. On day 11, which was a Sunday, Louisa went to church with Cora and sat in the third pew and sang the hymns with the rest of the congregation, and when she came out into the pale spring sunlight, Vernon Morgan was not there. He had not been in the church. He was not in the street. His gray horse was not at the livery. She told herself this was fine. She told herself she had known. She told herself the absence of a near stranger was not something that warranted the particular hollowness she was feeling, and she took Cora home and made lunch and read aloud from a book of illustrated nature essays she had brought from Missouri, and she was on page 40 when she noticed that the story of the frogs in the eastern marshes was blurring slightly, and she closed the book and pressed her fingers to her eyes and sat very still. She had not cried over Fletcher. She was not going to cry over a man whose last name she had learned from Hector Slade and who had spoken perhaps 40 words to her across 11 days. She was absolutely not. She did not cry. She went to bed early and woke before dawn, and when she went to the porch to get water from the rain barrel, she found the rocking horse. And we are back to where we began. She stood with the rocking horse in her arms and her daughter's delight spreading across the room like warm light. And she understood with terrible clarity that Vernon Morgan had spent his evenings in the livery not doing harness repairs, but carving that horse, working by lantern light with his good hand and his scarred one, shaping something beautiful and completely unnecessary for a little girl he had spoken 6 words to. And then he had brought it before sunrise on the morning he left and put it on her porch and vanished, and she did not know why. She sat down on the floor of her kitchen while Cora rocked the little horse with fierce, concentrated joy, and she turned that question over and over the way you turn something in your hands when you are trying to find the part that gives way. There was a dark past in there somewhere. She could feel it the way you feel weather before it arrives, a change in pressure. There was a secret he was carrying, something that had convinced him that leaving was the only responsible thing he could do. There was a hidden motive behind every careful distance he had kept from her, every measured word, every look that was full of something he was working hard to keep contained. A man does not carve a rocking horse for a child he does not care about. A man does not carve a rocking horse for a child whose mother he does not love. That was the thought she could not put down. It sat with her all day and the next day and the day after that, and by the end of the first week she had stopped pretending it was going to leave on its own and started trying to figure out what she was going to do about it. The practical answer was nothing. The practical answer was that he was gone and she did not know where, and she was a schoolteacher in Mallory Creek, Texas, with a 4-year-old daughter and a house and 8 students who needed her, and she could not simply pack up and ride after a drifter who had not even left his name on the gift. But she knew his name, and she knew where drifters generally went, because in a world without many secrets she had listened carefully to enough conversations at the general store and the livery to know that the trails in 1879 ran in predictable directions, and a man riding west out of the Texas panhandle was likely heading toward New Mexico territory, possibly toward the ranches along the Canadian River where they were always hiring in the spring, or possibly farther, toward the silver towns in the mountains where a man with skilled hands and no attachments could find work and disappear. She wrote him a letter. She had no address. She wrote it anyway, because writing was how she organized the inside of herself, and she sat at her kitchen table on a Tuesday night after Cora was in bed, and she wrote 5 pages in her careful schoolteacher's hand, and then she read them back and burned them because they said too much. She wrote another letter, 2 pages, and burned that too. She wrote a final letter, half a page, that said only, "You left something behind that was not the horse. If you would like to discuss it, I am in Mallory Creek." She folded it. She did not send it because she had no address. She kept it in the tin box where she kept the $47, which had grown to $63 since she started teaching. 3 weeks passed. Louisa taught her students. Cora rode the rocking horse every morning before breakfast, which had become a ritual so entrenched that if Louisa suggested they might skip it one day, Cora looked at her as though she had suggested something genuinely alarming. The horse sat in the corner of the main room in a patch of morning light, and its carved eyes had that quality of good folk art, which is that it seems to be watching you from different angles depending on where you stand. On a Wednesday in the middle of April, Hector Slade stopped Louisa on her way to school and told her, with the slightly awkward manner of a man delivering information he suspects will be more significant than it looks, that he had received a letter from a man in Tucumcari, New Mexico, asking after the condition of the gray horse, and that he had written back and told the man the horse was fine and had been given to a family on the Caprock Road who could use a steady animal. Since Vernon had left it there when he left, which Hector seemed to find both peculiar and touching, Louisa received this information with a controlled expression. "Do you have the address?" she asked. "The one he wrote from." Hector scratched his jaw. "I might still have the envelope," he said. "He is at a place called the Ramona boarding house in Tucumcari. Said he was working for a man named Galvez who has a carpentry operation there." Carpentry. Of course. Of course that was where the hands had gone. Louisa said thank you with such composure that Hector had no idea anything important had just happened, and she walked to school and taught multiplication tables and the geography of the eastern river systems with her whole functioning brain, while the other part of her was already in motion. She could not go to Tucumcari. She was a schoolteacher with a contract through June. She could not leave Cora, and she could not take Cora on a journey of that length. Tucumcari was at least 140 miles west, 2 to 3 days by wagon on roads that were unpredictable in spring. She had no one to travel with. She had no reason to go that any reasonable person would recognize as sufficient. She went anyway. She did not go immediately. She spent 2 weeks planning it with the thoroughness she brought to everything. And at the end of those 2 weeks she had arranged for her neighbor, a steady woman named Agnes Blount, to watch Cora for 5 days, had written to the Reverend Pike, explaining that a family emergency required her absence, and that she trusted her oldest student, a 13-year-old named Harold Fitch who was already reading at a level far above his age, to lead the younger students in their readers until she returned. She had $70 in the tin, enough for the journey and some margin. She hired a seat on the freight wagon that made the run west every Thursday, driven by a man named Calhoun who was 60 years old and deeply uninterested in other people's business. She did not tell anyone where she was actually going or why. She told Agnes she was settling some legal matter connected to Fletcher's estate, which was technically not entirely impossible even though the actual estate had been settled 2 years ago. She left on a Thursday morning at 6 o'clock. It was the first week of May. The air was cool and smelled of grass, and the sky was the pale, luminous blue of a Texas spring that hasn't fully committed to its warmth yet. Cora clung to her neck for a long moment and then let go with the resilience of a child who trusts that the people she loves will come back, and Louisa kissed her daughter's face and hair and walked to Calhoun's wagon and climbed up without looking back, because if she looked back she would get off the wagon. The journey took 2.5 days. Calhoun was not a conversationalist, which suited her perfectly. She read. She watched the landscape change from the flat grassland of the Texas panhandle to the rougher, redder country of the New Mexico territory, the earth lifting and breaking into mesas and arroyos. The sky somehow bigger here, or differently big, the kind of sky that makes you feel simultaneously enormous and very small. She arrived in Tucumcari on a Saturday afternoon. It was a rough but functioning town, smaller than she had expected, built along a creek with a single main street of adobe and timber buildings that had the provisional look of a place still deciding what it wanted to be. The Ramona boarding house was on the north end of the street, a wide adobe building with a red painted door and window boxes that someone had planted with early geraniums. She got a room. She washed her face and changed her dress, which was the navy blue one she wore when she wanted to feel capable and composed. She sat on the edge of the narrow bed and had a brief but thorough conversation with herself about what she was doing. She was a 26-year-old widow who had traveled 140 miles to find a man who had left her a rocking horse he had not signed. The man had not written to her. The man had not indicated in any direct way that he wanted to be found. He had been careful, consistently and deliberately careful, to keep exactly the kind of distance that was now between them. She was either brave or foolish. She was not certain there was a meaningful difference. She found Galvez's carpentry shop the next morning, which was a Sunday, and it was closed, and she stood in front of it for a moment looking at the good quality of the work in the window displays. Chairs and tables, and a cabinet with dovetail joints so precise they looked machine-made. And then she turned around and found Vernon Morgan standing approximately 10 feet away on the opposite side of the street, staring at her, as though she were something he had imagined and had not expected to materialize. The shock on his face was total and unguarded, and she had just long enough to register it before he reorganized himself, and she watched him do it, watched the careful composure come down over his features like a shutter closing, and it made her angry in a way that was clarifying rather than destructive. "Miss Leland," he said. His voice was level. His eyes were not. "It is Mrs. Leland," she said, "though the Mr. in question has been dead for 2 years, so the distinction is increasingly technical." He took a step toward her and stopped. "What are you doing here?" "I found the horse," she said. Something moved across his face. "I did not sign it." "No," she agreed. "You did not." That was cowardly. The word landed on him like a physical thing, and she saw him absorb it, and she saw something in him shift the way the compass needle had shifted in her chest that first day, some internal pivot point giving way. "Louisa," he said. It was the first time he had used her given name. It was not lost on either of them. "Come and have coffee with me," she said. "That is all I am asking, coffee and honesty. Whatever comes after that is between you and your conscience." He looked at her for a long moment, and she held his gaze without flinching, the way she held the gaze of difficult students, steady and patient and entirely resolved. And then he said, "All right." There was a small restaurant adjacent to the boarding house that served coffee and cornbread on Sundays, and they sat across from each other at a table by the window with the New Mexico morning coming in around them, and Louisa poured coffee from the pot the proprietress left between them, and she looked at Vernon Morgan and waited. He talked. It took a while for him to start, and then once he started it came out in the uneven, careful way that things come out when someone has been holding them for a long time, not a flood, but a deliberate unlocking of one chamber at a time. He had grown up in Virginia, near Charlottesville, the son of a cabinet maker. He had learned woodworking before he learned to read. He had gone to war at 20, fighting for the Union despite being Southern-born, which had fractured his family and earned him the specific kind of enmity that runs in families long after the official hostilities are over. He had come back from the war with the scar on his hand, which he got not in battle, but in a logging accident near Chattanooga the winter after Appomattox, when he had been working a saw crew because there was nothing else. He had married in 1869. Her name was Caroline. She had been from Kentucky, the daughter of a preacher, and she had been extraordinary. Vernon described her with a spare, careful quality that told Louisa more about the depth of his grief than any eloquence could have. They had a son, James, born in 1871. In 1873, riding back from a trip to the general store in their small Tennessee community, Caroline's wagon had overturned on a flooded creek crossing. She and James had both drowned. He stopped talking. He looked at his coffee. "Vernon," Louisa said, and her voice came out softer than she intended. "I left after that," he said. I could not stay in a place that was full of things that were supposed to have her in them. I went west. I have been going west more or less since 1874, 5 years. 5 years of moving, of working, of sleeping in places that required no attachment. 5 years of being the man who was always passing through. "Cora," Louisa said, not a question, a statement. He looked up. "Yes," he said, "when you saw her, that first day on the school steps." "I did not plan the horse," he said, and the honesty in his voice was raw. "It started because there was scrap oak at the livery, and I needed something to do with my hands in the evenings. And then I was making it, and it was for her, and I did not stop. But you left." "I always leave," he said, and the words had the quality of a belief he had held so long it had calcified into certainty. "That is not a personality trait," Louisa said. "That is a decision you keep making." He looked at her with those gray-green eyes, and she could see the conflict in him clearly now, the dark past, and the possibility of something else pulling in opposite directions, and the fear that loving something and losing it again would be the thing that finally broke him the rest of the way. "I know you think leaving is the safe choice," she said. "For you and possibly for us, I understand why. I have read enough about grief to know that the mind, after a great enough loss, will interpret attachment as threat. It will make you feel that the kindest thing you can do for someone you care about is to remove yourself from their life before they can come to depend on you and lose you." He was very still. "But here is what I know about myself," she said. "I have a daughter who rocked your horse 6 times before breakfast this morning, 6 days after you left it on my porch, as though it is the most important object in her world. I have a life that I built carefully out of wreckage, and I have not invited anyone into it in 2 years because I am discriminating, and because I do not make mistakes the same way twice." She paused. "I am here, Vernon. I rode a freight wagon 140 miles on unpredictable roads in the spring mud because a man who does not know how to stay left something so full of tenderness on my porch that it made me furious with him for leaving." His jaw was working. His hands were flat on the table. "I am not asking you to decide anything today," she said. "I am asking you to be honest with me. About whether you feel something, and about whether you are afraid, and about whether the fear is going to win." Silence. The sound of Tucumcari waking up outside the window, a dog, boots on the boardwalk, the coffee cooling in their cups. "I felt it the first day," he said. His voice was rough. "When you were standing in front of the general store, I thought I should ride past and keep going. But you did not. But I did not." He looked at his hands, the scarred one, the good one. "I spent those 11 days in Mallory Creek trying to convince myself I was imagining it. That you were a practical woman with a practical life, and that what I was feeling was just proximity. Loneliness recognizing loneliness. And what do you think now?" He looked at her, and the shutters were down, and what was behind them was what she had guessed from the beginning, something large and careful and long contained, something that had been waiting for a place to put itself. "I think I have never carved a rocking horse before," he said, "and I think I would like to stop leaving." The breath she released was not a sound she had planned to make. She pressed her fingers to the table. She looked at him. "That is the most honest thing you have said since I sat down. I am working on it," he said. She smiled then, the first fully real smile she had given him, not the composed schoolteacher's smile or the polite widow's smile, but the actual one, and he looked at it like a man seeing something he had forgotten could exist. "Then you had better come back to Mallory Creek," she said. He went back with her. Not immediately. There were 2 weeks remaining on his obligation to Galvez, and Louisa respected that, not least because it told her something important about the kind of man he was. She rode back on Calhoun's wagon after 3 days in Tucumcari, during which she and Vernon had walked the town together in the evenings after his workday ended and talked with a thoroughness that was both exhilarating and slightly exhausting, the way conversations are when 2 private, self-sufficient people finally decide to tell the truth. She learned. He was 31. He could build almost anything from wood. He had read widely and haphazardly, the way men read when they are moving and can only carry a few books at a time. He had a dry, quiet sense of humor that appeared unexpectedly and was more effective for being unexpected. He believed in God with a complexity that had nothing to do with the uncomplicated faith of the frontier church. He was afraid still, underneath everything, but the fear was no longer organizing his choices, or he was working very hard to make that true. She told him about Fletcher. She had not talked about Fletcher to anyone in the way she talked to Vernon about him, without apology for the complicated mixture of grief and anger, and sad understanding that the marriage had left her with. Vernon listened in the specific, concentrated way of a man who has learned that listening is its own form of respect. On the last evening before she left, they walked along the creek at the edge of town and the sky went pink and orange, and then that deep, saturated purple that the New Mexico sky does at dusk, which is different from Texas purple and different again from Virginia purple, and Vernon stopped walking and turned to her and said, "May I?" which was not a complete sentence, but she understood it. She said yes. He kissed her once gently, with the careful restraint of a man who is aware that this is a beginning and not an arrival, and she kissed him back, and the cottonwoods along the creek made their rattling sound in the evening wind, and Louisa Leland thought, yes, that is what it is supposed to feel like. She went back to Mallory Creek and she did not tell anyone what had happened, not directly, though Agnes Blount looked at her face when she returned and raised an eyebrow and said nothing, which was Agnes's version of a very long conversation. Cora was delighted to see her. Louisa held her daughter for a long time in the doorway and told her she had missed her very much and asked if the rocking horse had behaved itself. And Cora said yes, but that it had been lonely, and Louisa laughed for the first time in weeks. 2 weeks later, on a Thursday evening, Louisa was on the porch after supper when she saw a rider coming up the road from the west on a brown horse. Vernon had sold the gray before leaving, since that horse had been given to the family on the Caprock Road, and he had acquired a solid brown quarter horse in Tucumcari that suited him better. He rode up to the house and stopped in the yard and looked at her on the porch and said, "I am back." "I see that," she said. "I do not have a position yet," he said. "I was hoping to speak to Hector Slade about work." "Hector would be glad of the help," she said. "Come in and eat something." He ate at her table, and Cora, who had been put to bed an hour before but had a supernatural awareness of interesting events, appeared in the doorway of her room in her nightgown and looked at Vernon with the frank assessment of a 4-year-old and said, "You are back." "I am," he said. "Good," Cora said, with the decisive finality of a child who has made up her mind, and padded back to bed. Louisa and Vernon looked at each other across the table, and both of them were trying not to smile, and failing, and the kitchen was warm and the lamp made everything amber and soft, and outside the Texas stars were doing their extravagant thing, and it was, Louisa thought, a moment she would keep. He started at the livery again, working for Hector, and within 2 weeks he had established such a reputation for the quality of his woodwork doors, window frames, furniture, that he had more requests than he could fill. He set up a small workspace in a building Hector did not use, paid rent for it in labor, and by July he had enough steady work to support himself. He came to supper 3 times a week, then 4. Then most evenings, arriving at 6 and staying until 8, reading to Cora sometimes from the Nature Essays book, which Cora had claimed as her own, or sitting on the porch with Louisa in the long summer evenings, talking with the ease of 2 people who have gotten past the performing of themselves and arrived at the actual selves underneath. He was careful with her. He was careful in ways she recognized because she had been careful with herself for years. The deliberate pace, the respect for what she had built, the understanding that she was not a woman who would be swept up by anything, and that this was not a flaw to be worked around but a quality to be honored. He brought Cora a set of carved wooden animals in August, a horse, a dog, a rabbit, a cow, and Cora received them with the gravity of someone accepting something of great importance, and arranged them on the windowsill of her room in a specific order that only she understood the logic of. In September, on a warm evening when the heat of summer was finally beginning to let go and the air smelled of turning grass and something like possibility, Vernon and Louisa were on the porch, and he took her hand not suddenly, not dramatically, just picked it up from where it was resting on the arm of her chair and held it in both of his, the scarred one and the good one, and looked at it as though he was working up to something. "I want to ask you something," he said. "Then ask it," she said. "I want to ask you properly," he said. "I have been thinking about how to do this. I do not do things impulsively. I want you to know that this is not impulsive." "Vernon," she said. "I want to marry you," he said. "I want to stay. I want to stop being someone who passes through, and I want to be here with you and Cora, and I want to build something real. I know that is a great deal to ask of someone who has already had one marriage that did not serve her, and I know that I am still, sometimes, afraid, but I am more afraid of another year of not asking than I am of asking." The evening was golden. The road was empty. Somewhere down the street, someone's hound was making its slow, comfortable sound, not alarmed by anything, just announcing its presence to the world. "Yes," she said. His hands tightened around hers. "Yes, yes," she said again. "You are a man who carves a rocking horse for a child he has barely spoken to and brings it at dawn without signing it, because you could not help making something beautiful even when you were trying to leave. I have been in love with you since approximately that moment, and I would very much like you to stop drifting and stay." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips to her knuckles, and the tenderness of it was so complete that she felt it all the way through, the way you feel something when it is true. They were married in November, in the timber church, in front of the Reverend Pike, who had long since revised his opinion of Louisa Leland, and who performed the ceremony with the solemn dignity it deserved. The congregation of Mallory Creek attended in full, which said something about how the town had come to regard both of them, Louisa, who had built a life with her hands and her mind, and Vernon, who had arrived as a stranger and become something else entirely through the patient work of staying. Agnes Blount cried. She would deny this afterward. Cora wore a white dress with a blue sash and stood at the front of the church holding a bunch of dried wildflowers, because it was November and fresh flowers were not available, and she took her role as a witness with extreme seriousness. At the moment when the Reverend pronounced them married and Vernon bent to kiss Louisa, Cora announced to no one in particular and everyone present, "Good," in the same tone she had used the night he came back. The winter of 1879 was gentler than the previous one. Vernon moved into the house, and what had been a widow's home with a narrow, careful quality to it, the sense of a space arranged precisely to take up as little room as possible, became something warmer and more expansive. He made Cora a new bookshelf for her room, with carved birds along the top rail that she named one by one. He made Louisa a writing desk of the kind she had admired in the general store's catalog, but could never have afforded, smooth-topped and well-jointed with a small drawer that locked with a brass key. She cried when she saw it. Properly cried, the first time she had cried in front of another person since Fletcher died, and she was not embarrassed because it was Vernon, and with Vernon she had decided, without making a formal declaration of it, that she was going to be entirely herself. He held her while she cried, and he did not say anything, which was exactly right. His carpentry business grew through the spring of 1880. He hired a young man named Tomás Vargas, a 17-year-old from a family of Mexican settlers who had been in New Mexico longer than the territory had been American, and who had hands that were naturally gifted for fine work. Vernon taught him with the patience he brought to everything, and Tomás became in a short time genuinely skilled, and the shop, which they called Morgan Woodworks on a hand-lettered sign that Louisa painted, became one of the most reliable businesses in Mallory Creek. Louisa continued teaching. The town had grown enough by 1880 to warrant a proper school building, a single-room structure with 4 windows and a good stove, built of course by Vernon and Tomás with help from half the men in town on a warm Saturday in April. When they raised the last wall and Vernon came down from the scaffolding and walked over to where Louisa was standing with a pitcher of lemonade she had been distributing to the work crew, he had sawdust in his hair and a look of uncomplicated satisfaction on his face that she had learned over the winter to recognize as his happiness expression, not dramatic, never dramatic, but absolutely genuine. She gave him a glass of lemonade and she reached up and brushed the sawdust out of his hair, and he caught her wrist gently and held it for a moment and kissed the inside of it. And somebody across the yard made a noise that was either a wolf whistle or a sneeze, and they did not care at all. Louisa discovered she was expecting a child in June of 1880. She told Vernon on a Sunday morning before church, sitting at the kitchen table with their coffee, and she watched his face go through a rapid sequence of emotions. First the shock, then something complicated she recognized as the ghost of old grief, then the present overtaking the ghost, which took perhaps 3 seconds but felt important to witness. Then he put his coffee down and he stood up and came around the table and pulled her to her feet and held her with a completeness of intention that said everything he was not saying out loud. "Are you all right?" she asked, because she needed to know. "Yes," he said, into her hair. "Yes, I am very yes," she laughed. He tightened his arms around her. Cora, who came to the kitchen doorway at that moment still in her nightgown, surveyed the scene and said, "What is happening?" "We have some news," Louisa said, extricating herself from Vernon's arms. "Is it good news?" Cora asked. "Very good," Vernon said. Cora thought about this. "Are we getting a dog?" she asked. There was a pause. "A baby," Louisa said. "We are having a baby." Cora processed this. "Will it be able to ride the rocking horse?" "When it is old enough," Vernon said. "I will teach it," Cora said with immense authority and went back to her room to get dressed. Vernon looked at Louisa. Louisa looked at Vernon. "She is extraordinary," he said. "She has always been the sharpest person in any room she enters," Louisa agreed. "She gets it from her mother." "Obviously," he said, with the dry quality she loved, and kissed her temple. The pregnancy was straightforward, and Louisa, who had an honest and scientific attitude toward physical reality, managed it with characteristic composure, broken only occasionally by the weeks in August when the heat was truly excessive, and she felt strongly that the world had been poorly designed. She continued teaching until October, when the child was due, at which point she arranged for Harold Fitch, who was now 16 and had grown into a genuinely gifted young teacher, to manage the school through the winter with oversight from Reverend Pike. Their son was born on a Tuesday in October 1880. He was large and healthy and furious at the indignity of arrival, which made the midwife, Mrs. Clara Reyes, declare him a son of good strong character. They named him James, which Vernon had asked for, and Louisa had agreed to without hesitation, understanding that naming a child for the one who had been lost was not a shadow but a kind of grace, a way of carrying forward something precious without being destroyed by it. Vernon held James for a long time on the evening of his birth, sitting in the chair by the window with the infant settled against his chest, and his face in the lamplight was something Louisa, still in bed and watching, could not entirely describe. It was the face of a man coming back to himself from a very long distance, the face of someone who has finally accepted that he is allowed to have this. She loved him so much in that moment that it was like a physical pressure. She had not known before Vernon that love could feel like that, like something solid, something structural, something that held rather than trapped. "James," Vernon said quietly to the baby who was sleeping now. "He looks like you," Louisa said. "Poor thing," Vernon said, and the dry humor in it made her laugh, and James stirred at the sound and made a small, indignant face, and Cora, who had been permitted to stay up for the occasion and was sitting on a low stool in the corner like a very serious miniature person, said, "He is frowning already. Is that normal?" "Very normal," Louisa said. "Good," Cora said. James grew. He was a forthright, amiable baby who developed into a forthright, amiable toddler, and Cora, who had been born with a protective instinct so strong it could have powered a small engine, took her role as elder sibling with absolute dedication. She taught him the names of the carved wooden animals. She showed him how to properly use the rocking horse when he was old enough to sit upright. She explained to him the specific order of the birds on her bookshelf, which she had never explained to anyone else. By 1882, Mallory Creek had grown considerably. The cattle trade had stabilized along the new rail lines running west, and the town had acquired a proper bank, a second general store, a physician who was not also a dentist, and enough residents to sustain a genuine social life. Vernon's shop had expanded twice and now employed Tamaz, and a second young man named Billy Aldercott, Nora's youngest son, who had shown up at 15 asking to sweep floors and had proven with time to have a genuine aptitude for Finnish carpentry. Louisa was elected to sit on the new town education board, which was the first such body in Mallory Creek's history, and which she proceeded to run with the same precision she brought to everything, successfully arguing for the hiring of a second teacher so that older and younger students could be taught in separate groups, and for the expansion of the school library, which she accomplished in part through a letter-writing campaign to publishers in the East who occasionally donated books to frontier schools if you knew how to ask. She knew how to ask. In the evenings, in the life they had built in the house that had once been just hers and Cora's, she and Vernon sat on the porch in good weather and talked, or read, or simply sat in the comfortable quiet that is the specific gift of two people who have agreed to be fully known by each other. He had stopped running. The evidence of this was in everything. The way he planned for the next season's work, the way he talked about Cora's eventual education, the way he put things in the ground, a kitchen garden in the spring, a young cottonwood tree near the fence that would take decades to reach its full size and that he planted anyway. "You are planting a tree you will not see full grown," Louisa said, watching him. "Cora will see it," he said. "James will climb it." She looked at him for a long moment and he looked back, and she thought about the man who had ridden into Mallory Creek on a gray limping horse 3 years ago, the man who was always leaving, who had let himself love something so quietly and completely that he had built a rocking horse in the dark rather than admit it, and then run from what the building of it meant. "I am glad you stayed," she said. He walked over to where she was standing and he put his arms around her and held her in the afternoon light, the garden smell around them and the Texas sky overhead doing its enormous, indifferent, beautiful thing, and he said, "I could not have done otherwise. Eventually." "Eventually," she agreed. "I tried to leave," he said. "I know. You followed me to New Mexico." "I did." "That was either very brave or very alarming," he said. "I have always thought those were basically the same thing," she said. He laughed, the real one, the one that came fully out and kissed her, and the cottonwood sapling bent in the afternoon wind, and the house behind them held its warmth. The following year, 1883, brought Louisa's second pregnancy, which she announced to Vernon in the manner she had adopted for such occasions, direct and early, at the kitchen table with coffee. He received it this time without the complicated sequence of emotions, just the clean, straight-line joy of a man who has accepted that his life contains this kind of abundance and is no longer afraid of what it means. "Another one," he said. "Another one," she confirmed. "Cora is going to have opinions," he said. "Cora always has opinions," Louisa said. "They are usually correct," Vernon said. "Yes," Louisa agreed. "That is the challenging part. Cora did have opinions." She wanted a sister this time, she announced, with a specificity that suggested she had given the matter extensive thought. She had decided the sister would be named Clara, after the midwife who she regarded with great respect. She communicated this preference to anyone who would listen, including Reverend Pike, who received it with more good humor than might have been expected. The baby arrived in the spring of 1884, and it was in fact a girl, which Cora received with the expression of someone whose faith in the right ordering of things has been confirmed. They named her Clara because Cora's judgment was, as Vernon had noted, usually correct, and because Clara Reyes was indeed a woman deserving of the honor. Clara was different from James in almost every way, quieter, more watchful, with her father's gray-green eyes and her mother's precise, observant intelligence. She had a quality of stillness that was not shyness but attention, the way some children seem to be taking everything in carefully before deciding what to do with it. Vernon made her a cradle with carved flowers along the rail, and when she outgrew it, he made her a bed with a headboard shaped like a series of arching branches. He was, by this point, a man who made beautiful things for the people he loved as naturally and continuously as breathing. Louisa sometimes walked through the house and took inventory of the Vernon-made objects: the writing desk, the bookshelves, the kitchen table, the chairs, the new porch railing he had replaced last summer, the little cabinet in the hallway with the brass fitting he had mail-ordered from a catalog and waited 3 months for, and felt something that was not quite pride and not quite gratitude but lived in the space between them. She had a word for it in her own private vocabulary. She called it rightness. The settled, confirmed sense that the shape of one's life corresponds to something true. The rocking horse still stood in the corner of the main room. It had been repainted twice, once by Louisa when the paint began to chip, and once by Cora herself at age 8, who had repainted it with considerable accuracy and added a small white star on the horse's forehead that had not been there before. Vernon had seen the star and said nothing, which was his way of approving it completely. James had ridden it. Clara rode it now, at 2 years old, with the fierce concentration of someone fully committed to a task, and Vernon would sometimes pause in the doorway watching her, and his face would have the quality Louisa had first seen when he looked at Cora on the school steps, that layered, complicated tenderness. And then it would open into something simpler, something that had been cleaned of the old grief without erasing it. He had kept the promise of James's name. He talked about Caroline and the James who had been, when it was right to, not often, not in a way that pulled him backward, but honestly the way healthy people keep their dead, present without being consuming. Louisa had learned to hold space for that with the care it deserved, and she thought that was part of what love actually was, not the absence of complication, but the willingness to make room for each other's full and complicated truth. In the summer of 1885, Louisa's younger brother Edmund came from Missouri with his wife to visit, having read Louisa's letters over the years with increasing curiosity about this life she had made. He arrived expecting, she suspected, something provisional, a schoolteacher's meager circumstances, perhaps a certain brave sadness, the dignified solitude of a widow who had managed. What he found was Louisa standing in the door of a house full of children and the smell of dinner, with a husband who shook his hand and said he had heard a great deal about him, and offered a glass of whiskey with the confident ease of a man who is entirely at home in his own house. Edmund spent a week. He left with the thoughtful, slightly awed expression of a man who has revised his understanding of what his sister's life is. He wrote her a letter from Missouri 2 weeks after he returned that said simply, "I understand now. You were right to stay." She read it at the writing desk Vernon had made and felt the specific satisfaction of a person who knew all along and did not need the confirmation but welcomes it anyway. The town of Mallory Creek continued to grow. By 1886, it had a proper schoolhouse with 2 classrooms, and Louisa had stepped back from daily teaching to focus on the board and on a small project she had been working on for 2 years. A lending library, housed in a room at the back of the new town hall, stocked with books she had collected through donations, letter campaigns, and the occasional strategic purchase. It opened on a Thursday in April with approximately 60 volumes and more patrons than the room comfortably held. Vernon came on opening night and stood in the back, because the room was genuinely crowded with people who had not expected to be interested in a library and had come partly out of curiosity, and partly because Mallory Creek's social events were still limited enough that you attended most of them out of civic duty. He watched Louisa move through the room explaining the lending system she had devised, talking to ranchers and shopkeepers and children, and the elderly with the same quality of full, real attention she brought to every conversation. And he felt what he always felt watching her, that specific, private certainty that he was looking at the best thing he had ever had the sense to stop running from. Tomás Vargas, who had been working with Vernon for 6 years by now, and had become not just an employee but a genuine friend, got married in the spring of 1886 to a young woman named Rosalinda from the settlement east of town. Vernon and Louisa attended the wedding, and Vernon danced with more willingness than skill, which Louisa had always found endearing, and sat at a table with Hector Slade and his wife and Agnes Blount, who had never married but had strong opinions about the marriages of others, and expressed them with an affection that made them welcome rather than intrusive. Agnes, halfway through the evening and her 3rd glass of the rather good punch Rosalinda's mother had made, looked across the table at Vernon and Louisa and said, "I remember the day you went to New Mexico. I knew exactly where you were going." "You said nothing," Louisa said. "You were going to do it regardless," Agnes said. "I merely respected the inevitability." Vernon looked at Agnes. "Thank you," he said, "for watching Cora." "Cora watched herself," Agnes said. "I merely provided a nearby adult presence." She lifted her punch glass in a slight toast. "You are welcome, nevertheless." Cora, at 11, was tall and serious and intellectually voracious in the way her mother was, reading everything available and arguing the contents with anyone willing to engage. She had Vernon's quietness and Louisa's precision, combined into something that was entirely her own, a person who listened carefully and then said exactly the thing that needed saying and no more. She was good at mathematics. She was better at arguing. Vernon, when asked what he thought she would do when she was grown, said he thought she would do whatever she decided to do, and that the deciding would be the easy part. James, at 5, was social and energetic, and had the sunny, uncomplicated temperament that occasionally appears in families and is recognized by everyone as a specific gift. He had taken to following Vernon around the shop in the afternoons, picking up scraps of wood and asking questions with the unfiltered curiosity of a small boy who has decided that his father knows everything interesting there is to know. Vernon answered every question with full seriousness, which James received with total satisfaction. Clara, at 2, was beginning to talk in earnest and had developed strong opinions about the specific placement of her carved animals on the windowsill, which she rearranged daily in patterns that Louisa suspected were not random, but had a logic she had not yet decoded. On a December evening in 1886, with the first real cold of winter pressing against the windows and the stove going in the kitchen and the children in various states of bedtime, Louisa sat at her writing desk and looked at the tin box that had once held $47 and a half-page letter she had never sent. She had kept the tin. It held different things, now letters from Edmund, a ribbon from Cora's first recitation at school, a small folded note Vernon had left on her pillow once when she was sick, and he had gotten up at dawn to take the children to Agnes's so she could sleep, which said only, "I will be back by noon." Rest. A pressed blazing star, the kind that grew by the creek, the same kind that had been tucked under the rawhide knot on Cora's rocking horse. She had pressed it herself, the first spring after they were married, when she had found a new one blooming by the water. She heard Vernon's footsteps behind her and felt his hand on her shoulder, warm and steady, the way it always was. "Come to bed," he said. "It is late." She reached up and covered his hand with hers, the two of them, and looked at the tin box for a moment longer. "Do you know," she said, "that I wrote you a letter before I came to Tucumcari, a real one, half a page. What did it say? It said that you had left something behind that was not the horse." He was quiet for a moment. "Did I?" She turned to look at him. He was in the lamplight, the familiar face she had learned by 1,000 evenings of this exact quality of closeness, and he was looking at her with that expression that had no performance in it, just the clear, full recognition of one person seeing another person completely. "You did," she said. "You left the possibility of someone choosing to stay, of someone planting a cottonwood tree and making a writing desk and naming a son after a loss and learning that love is allowed to happen more than once." He crouched down beside her chair and took both her hands and looked at her, and the lamplight made everything warm and amber, and the house was full of sleeping children and the sound of winter outside and the smell of the stove. "I am sorry I ran," he said. "You came back," she said. "You came and got me," he said. "Semantics," she said. He smiled, the real one, the one she had been the reason for since that Sunday in Tucumcari. "I would have come back," he said. "I want you to know that. I knew by the time I got to New Mexico that I had made a mistake. I just did not know if I had the right." "You had the right," she said. "You always had the right, you just needed someone to tell you. 140 miles," he said, "through the spring mud. You were worth it," she said, marginally. He laughed and she pulled her hands free so she could put them on either side of his face, which she did sometimes when she wanted him to be exactly where she was. He let her. He always let her. "I love you," she said, because she said it the way she did everything, directly and meaning it precisely. "I love you," he said, and it was in his hands and his eyes and the steadiness of him, this man who had stopped drifting, who had put his roots down in Texas clay and refused to pull them up again, who built things for the people he loved and had learned to let them build things for him in return. She closed the tin box. She stood up and took his hand, the scarred one, which she had always preferred, because it was the one that had a story, and they went to bed, and the house was quiet and warm, and the rocking horse stood in the corner of the main room with its carved eyes and its painted star, and its little oiled leather saddle, watching over things the way good things made with love tend to do, enduring long past the night they were made in, long past the fears that almost prevented their making, into the mornings that follow and the years that stack up without anyone quite noticing how many there are until they look back and see the distance they have come. Vernon Morgan had carved a rocking horse and left it on a porch before dawn and ridden west, believing that what he was afraid of losing he should never have allowed himself to want. Louisa Leland had found it while the wood was still warm from his hands, and understood the truth of it precisely, and loved him for exactly the tenderness he was trying to hide, and had ridden a freight wagon through the spring mud of the Texas panhandle to tell him so. She had not waited for him to figure it out on his own. She never waited for things to happen to her. She went toward them, with her eyes open and her $63 in the tin and her half-page letter she had never sent, and she brought home what was hers. The rocking horse passed from Clara to the next child, a boy they named Robert, born in 1888, sturdy and loud and deeply interested in horses both carved and real. Then it went to the last of them, a girl named Margaret who arrived in 1891, and who had, in Louis's opinion, the most precisely accurate internal compass of any of her children, which was saying something given the competition. The house in Mallory Creek grew with the family. A new room added when Robert was born. a porch extension when Margaret arrived, a proper parlor built by Vernon and Tamaz over a summer when Vernon decided the family deserved a room that was not a kitchen for their gatherings. The cottonwood tree Vernon had planted grew slowly and with great determination, and by 1892 it was tall enough to provide genuine shade over the east side of the yard, and James had indeed climbed it many times, and Cora had sat beneath it to read, and Clara had named it, which was inevitable. Louisa taught until 1889, when she made the decision to focus entirely on the library, which had grown to over 400 volumes and had become genuinely important to the town, a place where people came not just for books, but for the sense that their small community was connected to a larger world of ideas. She ran it with the same combination of warmth and exactitude that had made her a good teacher, and the library became, over the years, one of the things Mallory Creek was quietly proud of. Vernon's shop had by 1892 become a genuine establishment, with 3 full-time craftsmen and a reputation that brought orders from as far as Amarillo and Santa Fe. He was not a wealthy man in any dramatic sense, but he was solidly, sustainably prosperous, and he worked with the same quality he had always brought to it: careful, patient, exact, and the work continued to be good because he had never allowed it to be otherwise. Cora went east to school in 1887, at 13, to an academy in Missouri near where Louisa's family lived. This departure was the single greatest act of will Louisa had performed since the freight wagon to Tucumcari, and she spent the first month after in a state of controlled grief that only Vernon fully understood, because he knew what it was to love something so completely that its necessary absence feels like structural damage. He left her alone when she needed it, and was present when she needed that, and said almost nothing about it directly because direct was not always the right instrument. Cora came home for summers and for Christmas, and she wrote letters that were so precisely articulate they were sometimes indistinguishable from published essays, and Louisa read them at the writing desk and replied at length, and was already in correspondence with people at the Missouri Academy about scholarship possibilities for girls who demonstrated exceptional ability. The dark past that Vernon had carried was not gone. It was never entirely gone, as losses that size rarely are, but it had been integrated. It lived in him the way old scar tissue lives, present and acknowledged but no longer governing. He talked about Caroline when something brought her to mind, and Louisa listened with the full, genuine attention she gave everything, and the children knew about the James who had come before in the way families know such things when they are told honestly, as part of the history that made their father who he was, the history that was not a betrayal of the present but the ground it grew from. James, their James, the one with the sunny temperament and the father's woodworking hands, began spending time in the shop at 10 years old and by 12 had made his first small cabinet, uneven at the joints but structurally sound, which Vernon put on a shelf in the shop and left there. When James asked why he was keeping it, Vernon said it was good work for a first effort, and there was no reason to throw out good work. It was still on the shelf in 1892, next to the cabinet James had made the following year, which was considerably better, next to the one after that, which was better still. In the spring of 1892, when the cottonwood tree had reached its fine full height, and the rocking horse in the corner had been repainted a 3rd time by Margaret, who had used more colors than strictly necessary but had executed the work with confident conviction, Louisa sat on the porch with Vernon on an evening that had the same quality as many other evenings they had shared on that porch: warm, unhurried, complete. They were 40 and 43, respectively, and they had the easy physical closeness of people who have shared a bed and a life for 13 years and know each other the way you know a landscape you have moved through in all weathers. Cora was 21 and at the academy. James was 12 and building things. Clara was 8 and still rearranging her animals with an internal logic no one else could follow. Robert was 4 and conducting a sustained campaign to get a real horse of his own. Margaret was 1 and had opinions about this, though she could not yet express them at full linguistic complexity. "Are you happy?" Vernon asked. It was not a question he asked often, which meant when he asked it, it was specific. Louisa looked at the cottonwood, which was moving in the evening wind the way he had known it would some day when he planted it. And she looked at the yard and the road beyond it and the Texas sky doing its final performance of the day in orange and rose. And she thought about a woman standing in pre-dawn light holding a lantern, finding a rocking horse still warm from someone's hands, and feeling the thing that she had felt, that terrible, exhilarating combination of recognition and grief. Knowing that something important had just happened, and already fearing it was already gone. And then she thought about the freight wagon and the red door of the Ramona boarding house, and a man standing in the street staring at her as though she were something he had thought was imaginary, and coffee on a Sunday morning, and the first kiss by the creek with the cottonwoods rattling, and the table she had eaten 30,000 meals at, and the children sleeping inside the house, and the tree growing in the yard, and the rocking horse with its 3 paint jobs and its star and its blazing star wildflower tucked long ago under the knot of rawhide that no longer existed, having served its purpose as the world's most indirect declaration. "Profoundly," she said. He put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and they sat on the porch as the evening came down and the stars began their extravagant Texas exhibition. And in the house behind them the last of the children dropped to sleep, and somewhere in the corner of the main room the rocking horse stood still in the gathering dark, exactly where it had always been, waiting for morning.